So as we normally do here, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, come back to you, you answer them, and then we proceed, we move on. Professor, please identify yourself and each one of you and make a concise question. Matthias.
Congratulations, Tanya and Thomas. It is a huge pleasure to hear you and to learn with your lessons. Let me to concentrate on the EU and Mercosur agreement firstly. And my question is, to what extent do you feel that this agreement can contribute to reshape international economic order in such a way that international economic order can be configured by multiple institutions such as WTO, regional agreements, and bilateral agreements. But Tanya highlighted at the end of her commentaries that the major problem that we are confronted now refers to the economic crisis, the unregulated international finance. And my question is, to what extent do you view a possibility to face this problem in the short run?
Another question, Matthias Spector. Matthias está ali no fundo aqui.
Thank you so much. That was great. I have one question for each. Professor Risa, towards the end of Professor Borsel's talk, she introduced the word hierarchy. And I was wondering what role it plays in your model, right? Because you're surely right that the origins of liberal global order have nothing to do with US power alone. And the origins are far more variegated. But surely hierarchy plays a major role. What is that role? Both internationally, but also, as Professor Borsel put it, regionally, right? The fact that France and Germany play the roles they play in Europe surely shaped not only the degrees of intrusiveness, but also the degrees of backlash against that intrusiveness. And my question to Professor Borsel is this. We really need a theory of what the mechanisms for backlash are, right? Because it's not enough to say that intrusiveness breeds backlash. What are the causal chains that lead from one thing to the other? Because when we look at South America, and here's the case study for you, I think, take what's happened in South America in the last 5 years. Countries were forced by a very hierarchical international system to reform their money laundering laws, starting with Brazil. And as a result of popular discontent, these reforms moved forward, and then room was open for the Lava Jato anti-corruption scandal. And as this thing kicked off, it unsettled the equilibrium in a big way. And suddenly, we learned that a lot of regional integration, as we knew it, was based on a corrupt scheme for the use of illicit funds to pay for political campaigns across South America. So the mechanism there is, the backlash is a produce of intrusiveness that works as an external shock on an equilibrium at regional level. But that's very different from the backlash you guys get in Europe from Greece or Italy or Spain or Portugal. So backlashes, we need a typology of backlashes, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about your project is that it opens up the room for theorizing about these differences. So I wonder what you thought about that.
Okay, given the complexity of the 2 questions, I think enough is enough. So back to you.
Okay, very briefly to the first issue, the EU-Mercosur agreement. So if this agreement comes into force, it's going to be the largest free trade area in the world, period. It is also the largest, what we call a deep preferential trade agreement, and that means the regulations go way beyond the economic area. They concern labor, social issues, health issues, environmental issues. So that's number one. Number two, the literature, there has been a long dispute in the literature whether these type of regional agreements go counter to or actually subvert the international economic order. So that is this trade diversion hypothesis. Most of the studies I know about say that that is complete nonsense. No, not complete nonsense, that is a little bit too strong, but that there is very little evidence for this, that in fact regional economic agreements foster better global agreements. So that if you want WTO on the one hand and the regional agreements actually reinforce each other. And if you look at the political attitudes inside countries, usually the same forces that would be in favor of an open global order would also be in favor of a regional order. So in that sense, I think I completely agree with your point, and I would be really curious to hear more about whether this EU-Mercosur agreement, what the fate of this is on this part of the agreement, i.e. Mercosur, and what the domestic situation in both Argentina and Brazil will do to it. Then the hierarchy question. There's a big debate in my field now about hierarchy in international relations. I don't have the time to get into this. I find it it has a very confused conceptualization of what hierarchy actually means. I'd rather talk about power asymmetries. Yeah, there was nothing in my presentation that suggested that that is an order among equals. I mean, that would just nonsense, and that was not my point. My point was, if you want, the benign role, if you want, of the United States in a lot of the post-World War II period was actually to subscribe to that order and in a way play when the old financial system, the dollar-based financial system until the early 70s, that was actually the U.S. was the lender of last resort at the situation, and then in the post-Vietnam years that collapsed. But I mean, in that sense, the U.S. was has been at least for a long time a leading power, guaranteeing this order. What I meant is the good news about a liberal international order is its openness and its open-endedness, that it allows for input by smaller states, all kinds of states, etc. I mean, if you look, I'll give you an example. If you look at the evolution of the international human rights regimes, it has been open to all kinds of new claims and debates. You know, it essentially started with property rights for landowners. This is the origins of human rights regimes. Then came political rights. Then came gender rights, rights of indigenous peoples, LGBTQ rights, etc. So these are universal claims, and we can debate, you know, to what extent power asymmetries, but it's a fundamentally open open system, and that was actually my main point. I'm not denying, of course, that there are power asymmetries, and the same what you said about Germany and France. But by the way, we both, I think you mentioned the Handbook of Comparative Regionalism. We did some work on the question of regional hegemons or regional leading powers, etc., on whether there are sort of positive or negative for regional integration, and unfortunately they are all over the place. Yeah, some are sometimes in the driver's seat, sometimes are blocking. yeah, sometimes switch from being in the driver's seat to blocking. It comes back to a comment by again John Ruggie on the debate about American hegemonic stability and the argument that you needed a hegemon for a world order. He would argue, okay, but look at it depends on what the purpose of the particular hegemon is. You know, you can have a destructor. You know, you can have really bad hegemony. So, and that the international system as such doesn't explain anything about that because at that point you need to look inside these things. And I agree totally with you on the typology of backlashes that we need. But this is Tanja.
Okay, again, I try to be brief. Let me start with Matthias' point about the different types of backlash. I think this is a very, very good point. You're absolutely right that in Latin America, the regional organizations, and that is actually a pattern we've also found in Africa, they're used as sort of an extension of clientelistic politics, right? You can give jobs. I mean, it's a kind of reward for, you know, neo-patrimonialism, or regionalized, right? Absolutely. And I suspect we also have that in the European Union to some extent, but it's much more controlled and contained. So I fully take that point. And that is different from the backlash in the European Union. But what, you know, when you go a little bit up the ladder of abstraction, I think what the two things have in common is that regional organizations are seen part of a problem and not part of the solution. And think about the rationale or the legitimacy, and that is the causal mechanism, legitimization for liberal intrusiveness at the regional or international level has never been one about democracy, and arguably cannot be about democratic legitimacy, right? It's very hard, even if we agree there is such a thing as a world society, you know. I don't want to get in this no demos discussion that there is no European people and hence there can be no European democracy, but there is a challenge. There truly is. It's also a matter of size. And so there are limits to democratic legitimacy at the regional and certainly at the international level. So we have to think of other ways of legitimization. And what are these? It's effectiveness, problem-solving capacity. The idea or the argument always been we need to do that at the regional or international level because the nation-state can no longer deal with these issues. Climate change being the most prominent example. You can add migration. You can add a lot of things. Now, and for the longest time, regional organizations, I think, have helped to solve these problems. Now, with the global financial crisis and the migration crisis in Europe, this perception has changed dramatically. Not only has the European Union not helped to prevent the global financial crisis, or has helped to prevent climate change, has helped to prevent social inequality. Some people actually argue that the European Union has made it worse, right? And I think that is the challenge we are facing across the board. Regional organizations and international institutions, more broadly speaking, are no longer seen as part of the solution. They're seen as part of the problem. And that's what I meant when I said we have I agree, these issues have to be dealt with at the international level. But we need to design institutions in a way that are capable of doing this. That brings me to Alberto's point about international regulation of international finance. You know, I mean, that is a long discussion, and I'm certainly not an expert. But 2 points here. Tax competition, I think, is a key issue here, right? We used to have the race to the bottom with regard to production sites, you know. Now we have the same competition for taxes, and Brexit is a primary example for that, right? But despite all the talk about getting out of the European Union because the European Union prevents Britain from striking trade agreements, what is this really about? What does Britain export to the European Union? It's financial services. It's not primarily 80% of the exports are financial services, and that's what Britain's issue with the European Union has always mostly been about. And only after they didn't get Thomas, was is that? Opt-out of future financial regulations the European Union might eventually adopt, and you know, that was the final straw. So I think that is one. And the other thing is, despite all the need for more effective international institutions, I do think we also need to talk about the responsibility of national governments. I'm sick and tired of these governments that blame everything bad on the European Union, the international system. I don't care. Nobody has forced the Greek government to cut welfare by 60% and leave the defense budget untouched. Greece is the second largest weapon importer in the European Union. So they spend a significant amount of their money on weapons rather than on welfare. Is that the fault of the European Union? I don't think so. But what the European Union allows national governments to do is to shirk their national responsibility. So again, it's an issue of legitimization, but the problem is rooted at the national and not at the international or the European Union level, and that needs to be addressed too.
We have time for one more round of questions. One here. Please, can someone...
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Felix Rigoli. I was a former consultant of the UNASUR Institute in Health here in Brazil. And I would like to, let's say, remark or ask you to further this explanation, because what I was reading here in Brazil and in other places is that the expansion of the financial sector is so huge, like 5-10 times the total GDP of the world, that probably these problems of tax evasion, tax corruption, fraud, corporate fraud, corruption in the, not only Lava Jato, but also Volkswagen and other firms, made, let's say, the big decisions, the big decision makers, think, why do we need an international order that can encroach into international capital circulation while we can still buy our own politicians in different countries that are much easier to buy and much
cheaper.
So much cheaper, or at least we know them. So my question is, do you think that this may be the main issue behind not the whole movement, but at least the movement, Steve Bannon, all the groups that are putting this forward with an ideology mixed with everything, but in the backstage, the financial interest in not being regulated by international institutions?
Please. Either one or the two. You can take this one, Thomas and Teddy.
You start.
Okay, I think this is an excellent point, and I'm very pleased that we talk so much about finance. You know, sometimes I feel like it's the finance stupid. It's not the economy. And again, something that I'm sick and tired of is about state leaders mostly that make believe citizens who suffer from crisis that it's all a problem of free trade, right? As if we only if we only balance our trade with China, all the problems would go away. A major part of the problem, also of social inequality, has to do with finance and not with free trade. And this obsession with trade, I think, is politically, as much as I think it is important to conclude free trade agreements, don't get me wrong, but it distracts attention from really important issues. Now, and I think there is a strategy behind that, of course. There are strong interests that have no interest in whatsoever in getting international financial regulations. Having said this, I think the Basel Agreement has been reformed in light of the global financial crisis. So there are things going on. But from all what my economist colleagues tell me, it's not enough to prevent another global financial crisis. So I have no answer to your point other than I fully concur with you that there are powerful interests. And we need to somehow, and I think one way to deal with these interests is by having a public debate about the requirements for financial regulation. And I know it is complicated, right? And it's so much easier to blame everything on free trade than to explain to people what is going on with the flow of capital. But I think this needs to be done because, you know, we're just waiting for the next crisis and disaster to happen. And even the European Union, despite the banking union and everything we've done, we are not prepared for yet another crisis of the magnitude we had in 2008. And the repercussions are still there. They go way beyond finance, right? And so I truly believe, and just a final point, that is also goes to us academics. There is so much debate about social inequality. And even the academics, the scholars, attributes most of social inequality to trade issues. And certainly that is part of the story, but it misses so much of the rest, and that is a main concern. So yes, migration, yes, climate change, but also fiscal regulation.
Very little to add. One issue just to explain why the political discourse is always about trade. It is simply a framing issue.
Yeah.
It's way easier to frame it, and you can make people immediately feel it. You know, you lose your job because all these goods are being produced in China. You know, that is easy to frame. And I think that explains to a large extent why. What is interesting, though, is, and I wanted to reiterate a point that Tanya made, that a lot of us, i.e. the academics, actually buy into this. You know, a lot of, inequality, the inequality issue, think Piketty in that book, etc., and what kind of repercussions it had. A lot of political economists jumped on this. And started to favor economic nationalism, when in fact a lot of the issues were actually about finance. Yeah, and just to reiterate Tanya's point, I'm not so familiar with Latin America, the situation, but the big nightmare in Brussels and in Berlin and Paris is very simple. It's Italian banks. 80% of them are, completely overdebted. And if this thing explodes in our face, bailouts, that is impossible. Even the ECB, that against the wish of the German populace, but certainly with the blessing of the German government, even though they would never admit that, at some point became, during the Euro crisis, the lender of last resort, and said the buck stops right here, and you can't. The financial markets would not bet against the central bank, because they're going to lose that thing, right? So, by the way, a little point on your remark. I don't think it's really the question of the amount of money. Yes, it's unimaginable, but I think. You pointed your finger to the right point. There are huge financial interests behind that, and politicians are very reluctant to really attack them. Partly because of the competition, because there will always be some safe havens, etc. Okay.
I will abuse my prerogative and to make the last question. It is about China. I want you to elaborate a little bit more about the ambivalence of China in the following specific sense. China is playing a very sophisticated game in the world sphere, which is at the same time being cooperative to old international liberal institutions and being specifically disruptive here and there. But also trying to build other alliances and other institutions which are not based on democratic values.
Absolutely.
Right? So how do you see this going forward? How do they balance these two strategies? And what would make them favor one, put emphasis on one or the other? And in this context, you said Russia is a declining power, but it still have a lot of power.
Yes.
And I want you to analyze this ballet between the two Asian players.
Let me start with Russia. I feel comfortable. There's a book that Robert Gilpin, the retired political economist of Princeton, and who was one of the people who talked about hegemonic stability theory and the rest of it, and he wrote a book about hegemonic cycles and what happens when hegemonic powers are starting to be in decline. They fight this, and he had various theories about this, and Russia fits very much that explanation. I mean, at the time Gilpin was writing, I mean, he would say, okay, this leads in the end to hegemonic war. Now, in the age of nuclear weapons, I think that's not in the cards, but Russia follows pretty much the blueprint that Robert Gilpin described in a book that was written in 1981, I think. So I feel comfortable, and it seems to fit. Okay, China, I think, is way more complicated. I start with one point. In the US now, there is this big talk about the new Cold War, and it seems that the entire political class, whether it's Republican or Democrats, are buying into this. Europeans are way more ambivalent about this, and my sense is on this continent it's also way more ambivalent with this. But I mean, let's not forget the old Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US. There was no economic interdependence between these two powers. This has totally changed. So if we go into a new Cold War with China, it's in a globalized economy, and China is completely integrated in that economy. And I think that changes the entire scorecard for this. Now, I'm not an expert on China. You should invite somebody who knows something about China. But in terms of observing this, there are certain issues that for China are kind of untouchable, and plus where they try actually now to really work against international organizations, and that is anything to do with human rights. Yeah, if you look at what China is doing in the various international human rights councils, etc., they are really blocking this big time. And if their diplomacy is in full swing, if you criticize the human rights record, etc., and at that point, I'd say now for liberal countries, I would say, folks, we have to stand our ground. We know that we disagree on these issues, yeah, but it makes no sense if you give in. That seems to be another impression. China doesn't respect you if you just try to accommodate them. But there's a whole literature now about status in international relations, and one issue is indeed status and respect for a great power. I mean, there's a whole rhetoric, or not rhetoric, but a whole discourse in China about the century of humiliation, and that now China is back, etc. I still think. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
think I should shut up.
No. I will protect you from her.
Only if you give
I'll cover you. It's a male alliance now here. You wait a minute. Okay. You go now.
So just to let you know, we are married for 21 years.
Yeah.
Okay. So part of the dynamics is
to come to the point.
Congratulations.
So anyway, to come back to China, I think there are still issues where China is very assertive on certain issues. For example, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot with their behavior in the South China Sea, because what they're creating is simply balancing behavior. by other countries, which is quite natural. I think this is stupid behavior, simply stupid, and is against Chinese interest because, I mean, who cares in the end about these islands? I mean, you can do it for kind of nationalist purposes, but I mean, it's all about steering up some stuff, and one could easily have a different policy.
There's oil and gas, honey.
A little bit.
Honey, honey adds insult to injury.
No. So I think there is still an ambivalence, but I think the policy response means engagement. Engagement in that sense doesn't mean that you agree with everything. Yeah. For example, I mean, I'm academic, so we know that Xi Jinping is trying to really oppress the universities. And a lot of our counterparts are now having real trouble. And the German government, unfortunately, I mean, for example, here's Nora, she is with the Freie Universität in Sao Paulo in the office. We have an office in Beijing, and that office was under an umbrella of a German, what was it, science house, something like here, the exactly, you know, and the Chinese made it very difficult to continue this. So this whole thing has collapsed. A lot of German academic organizations have left China, etc. And I thought we should have simply stood up against them, and the German government should have told, okay, if you're interested in scientific and academic cooperation, we need to do this on a balanced level, and you can't just interfere with academic freedom like this, you know. So I mean, engagement does not mean simple accommodation, yeah, and it's going to be very tough. At the same time, in a lot of global governance issues, China is now playing an extremely constructive role. I mentioned climate change. Yeah, there's a big change for domestic reasons, mostly in my view, public health issue, environment pollution in China itself. But China has changed its position toward the climate change issue almost 180%. And it's now playing a very, very constructive role, by the way, together with India. And so I can't help, but there is still this type of ambivalence, which in my view means engage. So, Tanya.
I mean, we almost always agree, but at that point, I have a more nuanced view on China. I think China is much smarter than Russia, right? They know how to play international institutions. But that, I think, makes them also more disruptive. And I think the disruptive role they play is not so much, or it's not only at the international, but it's mostly at the domestic level. Because China provides a counter model. And that is both in terms of money and ideas. And I'm not sure what is more dangerous, right? China just, I think, surpassed the European Union as in trade with Latin America. China is more important to trade for Latin America than Europe, not with regard to FDI. And that's why I think the Mercosur-EU agreement is so important, right? But in terms of trade, and China is trying to sort of work its way into particularly, you know, Latin America and European Union by buying itself into infrastructure. And so I work on Africa, and in Africa, China has been the clear alternative to the European Union, but also to World Bank conditionality. No conditions attached, right? You just have to eventually pay back the money. And if you can't, China owns it, right? That is their model. And also talking about empowering corrupt domestic elites. Sri Lanka has one of the largest airports in the world now. There's not a single plane starting. Why? Because China bribed major local officials there, right? And the Chinese going to own this airport. They don't care if the Sri Lankans are not using it. They want to use it eventually for their own purpose. So I'm not saying, you know, it's not, China has been extreme, that is my second point, China has been extremely effective in lifting people out of poverty, more than any of the ODA of OECD countries has been able to do. That makes it so dangerous. It's a very attractive model because it's been effective, particularly, and you tell me, in Latin America where poverty is still a major issue, right? And if I listen to Almo, for instance, right, I mean, when it comes to fighting poverty, he's not looking to Europe, he's looking to China. I don't know what kind of implications this will have, but so I think the disruptive effect potential China has is not only at the international level, it is also at the domestic level. And China, Salvini, when he was still the Minister of Interior in Italy, he's been toying with the idea of having, getting money from China rather than obeying the rules of the European Central Bank with regard to austerity. The Chinese bought the port of Piraeus in Athens. They own it. They're buying themselves into Iceland. Trump tried to buy Greenland. In the meantime, China is buying Iceland. I'm just, don't get me wrong. I'm getting polemic here. And there are also positive effects. I'm not saying. But if you believe that China has a different financial or capitalist model because it is a third world country, get real. China is, I think you have here that Lenin's theory of imperialism. I think there is a lot to be said about the techniques China is using, at least you can interpret it in a way. And that, I think, is a challenge, again, that it's hard to address, but I think we need to recognize that China as a challenge to the liberal, not only international, but also domestic order is real. And it's not only money.
I'm not saying it's real. It's not real.
I hope China don't make you break apart. Please.
It won't.
After 21 years. Not here.
And think about it, what it will do to the liberal international order.
I will not take sides here. I would just thank you so much for this wonderful and enthusiastic presentation. Wonderful.